The ruby caught the light like a drop of frozen blood against my collarbone, and I wondered if my mother had ever worn it to something as foolish as a blind date, or if she had saved it for occasions that actually mattered. My fingers trembled as I fastened the clasp, and the cool metal settled against my skin like a whisper from the dead. Charlotte had promised me this would be good for me, that I needed to get out and stop hiding in my apartment like some wounded creature waiting to die. But Charlotte did not have to squeeze into a black dress that barely concealed 5 months of pregnancy, or walk into a restaurant where the cheapest appetizer cost more than my weekly grocery budget. I smoothed my hands over the subtle swell of my belly, and told myself the empire waist hid it well enough. I was lying. I had gotten good at lying lately to my landlord about when the rent would arrive, to my boss, about why I needed extra shifts, to myself, about whether I was going to be okay. The father was a ghost now, just a memory of one reckless night, when I had wanted so badly to feel something other than grief and loneliness, that I had let a stranger touch me in ways I still dreamed about. He had vanished by morning, leaving nothing but rumpled sheets, and the beginning of a life I was not prepared to carry alone. The taxi pulled up to La Maison, and I stared at the glittering facade with its uniformed doorman and cascading flower arrangements, and felt my stomach clench with something beyond morning sickness. This was not my world. I belonged to fluorescent lights and sticky diner counters, and customers who counted their change before tipping. But Charlotte had insisted her cousin knew someone perfect for me, and I had been too tired to argue, too desperate for any connection that might make me feel less like I was drowning. I stepped inside, and the warmth wrapped around me, scented with expensive wine and fresh bread and the subtle perfume of women who had never worried about paying an electric bill. Crystal chandeliers scattered light across marble floors, and I felt every eye in the room catalog my discount dress and drugstore makeup and find me wanting. The hostess smiled with professional warmth and led me toward the back, where private tables offered the illusion of intimacy. That was when I felt it, a gaze so intense it burned against my skin like a physical touch. I turned my head, searching for the source, and found him. He sat alone at a corner table, dressed in a charcoal suit that probably cost more than my car, and he was watching me with eyes the color of winter storms. Dark hair swept back from a face that belonged on a Renaissance painting, all sharp angles and cruel beauty, and a mouth that looked like it had forgotten how to smile. Something about him made my blood run cold and hot at the same time, made every survival instinct I possessed scream that I should turn around and walk out and never look back. But my feet kept moving, carrying me toward whatever fate Charlotte had unknowingly arranged, and I touched my mother's necklace like a talisman against the darkness gathering in his stare. Now please take a moment and subscribe to our channel and comment where you are watching from and what time is it. It is always fascinating to see where these stories get all around the world. Thank you. He rose as I approached, and the movement reminded me of a predator uncoiling something fluid and dangerous beneath the expensive tailoring. His eyes never left mine, and up close I could see they were not merely gray, but shot through with fractured silver, like ice forming over deep water. I opened my mouth to introduce myself, to offer some pleasantry that might bridge the chasm of tension between us. But the words died in my throat, because his gaze had dropped to my chest, and his face had gone the color of old bone. For a moment, I thought he was staring at my breasts, and I felt a flush of indignation rise in my cheeks. But then I realized it was the necklace that had captured his attention, and the expression on his face was not lust, but something far more terrifying. Recognition. Grief. Rage. "Where did you get that?" His voice came out scraped raw, and I took an instinctive step backward, my hand flying to the ruby pendant like I could protect it from the violence in his tone. "I asked where you got that necklace. It belonged to my mother," I managed, and even to my own ears my voice sounded thin and frightened. He moved faster than I could track, and suddenly his fingers were wrapped around my wrist, not hurting, but holding with an unbreakable grip. He lifted my hand away from the necklace and leaned close enough that I could smell his cologne. something dark and expensive that made me think of midnight in foreign cities. The ruby caught the light between us, and his breath stopped entirely for 3 heartbeats that felt like centuries. "This is impossible," he said, and there was something broken beneath the words, something that made my fear shift sideways into confusion. "Please let me go." I tried to pull away, but I might as well have tried to move a mountain. His other hand came up and I flinched, expecting violence, but instead his fingers brushed against the pendant with a gentleness that contradicted everything else about him. He turned it over, examining the setting, the stones, the delicate filigree work, and I watched the color drain further from his face until he looked like a man confronting his own ghost. I buried this necklace. His eyes snapped to mine, and whatever softness had been there vanished, replaced by something cold and accusatory. I placed it around her neck myself, and I watched them close the coffin. "I do not know what you are talking about." I jerked my wrist again, harder this time. "Let go of me right now, or I will scream. Scream then." He did not raise his voice, but something in the quiet certainty of it made my blood freeze. "No one in this restaurant will help you, and even if they tried, my men would stop them before." They took 3 steps. The fear I had felt when I first saw him crystallized into something sharper, and I understood with horrible clarity that I had walked into a trap I did not even know existed. "I am leaving." I pulled with everything I had. "You are not going anywhere until you tell me how you came to possess the necklace I buried with my dead fiancé." I tried to run, but my body would not obey, and before I could draw breath to scream, 2 men materialized from the shadows of the restaurant, like they had been waiting for exactly this moment. They wore dark suits and blank expressions, and their eyes held the flat emptiness of men who had done terrible things and would do them again without hesitation. The other diners continued eating and laughing as if nothing unusual was happening, as if a pregnant woman was not being herded toward a back hallway by a man whose grip on her wrist felt like iron wrapped in silk. I looked around desperately, hoping someone would notice, would intervene, would do something. But the wealthy patrons kept their gazes fixed on their plates, and I understood with sickening clarity that this was a world where people knew better than to see what they were not supposed to see. He guided me through a door marked private and down a corridor lit by dim sconces that cast wavering shadows on burgundy walls. My heels clicked against marble floors, and the sound echoed like a countdown to something I could not name. The back room was smaller than I expected, furnished with leather chairs and a heavy oak table and windows that looked out onto nothing but darkness. He released my wrist, and I stumbled backward, putting the table between us, as if that flimsy barrier could protect me from whatever he intended. My hand flew to my stomach, an instinct I could not control, and I watched his eyes track the movement. For the first time, something other than cold fury crossed his face. "You are pregnant." It was not a question, but I answered anyway, my voice steadier than I felt. 5 months. He stared at the curve of my belly, barely visible beneath the empire waist, but unmistakable now that he was looking, and I saw his jaw tighten with some emotion I could not read. "The necklace." He returned his gaze to the ruby at my throat. "Tell me everything about how it came into your possession, and do not lie to me because I will know." "My mother gave it to me before she died." I kept my hand on my stomach, drawing courage from the life growing inside me. "She had it my whole childhood, and I never thought to ask where it came from, because it was just her necklace, just this beautiful thing she wore on special occasions. She passed when I was 18, and I have worn it ever since." He moved closer, and I pressed back against the wall, feeling the cool plaster through the thin fabric of my dress. His presence filled the room like a physical force, like the air itself had grown heavier in his proximity. "I do not believe in coincidences." His voice dropped lower, more dangerous. "That necklace is one of a kind, commissioned by a master jeweler 50 years ago, and I watched it go into the ground with the woman I loved. So either you are lying or something very wrong has occurred, and until I know which, you are coming with me. I cannot just leave with you. I have a job and an apartment and a life. You have nothing." The words were brutal in their simplicity. My men have already collected your things. Your landlord has been compensated for breaking your lease. As of this moment, Eleanor Fairfax, your old life is over. The car slid through the city streets like a blade through silk, and I watched the familiar landmarks disappear one by one until we passed beyond the boundaries of everything I had ever known. My hands rested on my belly, and I counted the minutes by the rhythm of my own breathing, trying to stay calm for the baby, if not for myself. He sat beside me in the back seat, close enough that I could feel the heat radiating from his body, but he did not look at me, did not speak, and the silence between us felt like a living thing coiled and waiting. The city gave way to suburbs, and the suburbs gave way to darkness, broken only by the occasional glow of distant windows, and then we turned onto a private road lined with ancient oaks whose branches formed a canopy overhead, blocking out the stars. I saw the gates, first massive iron things, topped with spikes, that gleamed in the headlights, and guards who nodded at the car without stopping it, because they knew who was inside. The estate sprawled before us like something from another century, all stone walls and mullioned windows and chimneys reaching toward the night sky. And I thought, this is where they will find my body someday, buried in some forgotten corner of these manicured grounds. He led me inside through a door held open by a man with dead eyes, and I caught glimpses of rooms filled with artwork and antiques of chandeliers that scattered light like frozen waterfalls of wealth, so vast it had become invisible to those who possessed it. The stairs curved upward, and I followed because there was nothing else I could do, my legs heavy with exhaustion and fear. The room he brought me to was beautiful in the way a cage can be beautiful. Four-poster bed draped in silk. Fireplace cold and dark. Windows that looked out over gardens I would never walk through. He stood in the doorway watching me take it in, and when I turned to face him, I saw something flicker behind his eyes. Something that might have been regret if he were capable of such a thing. Get some rest. His voice was flat empty of the rage that had driven him in the restaurant. We will talk in the morning. The door closed behind him, and I heard the lock engage with a sound like a death knell. I tried the windows first, pushing against frames that would not budge, pressing my palms to glass, thick enough to stop a bullet. The door was solid oak, and when I put my ear against it, I heard footsteps pacing, measured and deliberate. I sank onto the bed, still wearing my dress from the blind date that had become my abduction, and I pulled the necklace from my throat, holding it up to the lamplight. The ruby glowed like a heart torn from something living, and I wondered what secrets my mother had kept, what lies she had told to protect me, or perhaps to protect herself. Somewhere in this house, Alexander Sinclair was watching me through cameras I could not see, remembering a dead woman who wore my face. He came for me at dawn when the light through the barred windows was still gray and thin, and I had not slept at all. The door swung open without warning, and Alexander Sinclair filled the frame like a storm, given human form, his eyes the color of winter ice and just as cold. He wore a dark suit that probably cost more than I made in a year, and his presence sucked all the air from the room, leaving me gasping for breath I did not realize I had been holding. Tell me about your mother. Not a greeting, not an explanation, just a demand delivered in a voice that expected immediate compliance. I pushed myself up from the bed where I had been lying fully clothed, still wearing the dress from last night because I had nothing else, and I met his gaze with what little courage I could summon. Her name was Maria Fairfax. She worked as a seamstress in a shop downtown, mending clothes for people who could not afford new ones. She never talked about her past, and when I asked about my father, she would change the subject so smoothly, I did not realize until years later that she had never answered. She got sick when I was 17, and she was gone before my 19th birthday, and that necklace is the only valuable thing she ever owned. He moved closer, and I forced myself not to retreat, not to show the fear that was clawing at my throat. That is not enough. His voice dropped lower, more dangerous. That necklace does not appear out of nowhere. Someone gave it to her, or she took it, and I need to know which. I do not know what you want me to say. I heard my own voice rising, felt the anger building beneath the terror, because I was exhausted and pregnant and trapped, and this man was demanding answers I simply did not have. She was my mother, and she loved me, and she kept her secrets, and she died before I could ask the right questions. That is the truth, and you can keep me locked in this gilded prison forever, but it will not change the fact that I cannot tell you what I do not know. Something shifted in his expression, not softening exactly, but a slight relaxation of the predatory tension that had defined every interaction between us. He studied me like I was a puzzle he could not quite solve, and I watched him watching me and wondered if he saw whatever he was looking for. Kidnapping a pregnant woman will not get you what you want. I placed my hand on my belly deliberately, drawing his attention to the life I was protecting. Whatever this necklace means to you, whatever ghost you are chasing, I am not your enemy, and I am not your prisoner, and sooner or later you are going to have to accept that I am just a waitress who inherited a piece of jewelry from her dead mother. He was silent for a long moment, and when he finally spoke, his voice held something new, something that might have been respect grudgingly given. We will see, Eleanor Fairfax. We will see. The hours stretched into days, and the days blurred together until I lost track of how long I had been a prisoner in this beautiful cage. Alexander came and went like a storm that could not decide whether to break or retreat. And in his absence, I paced the room and wondered if anyone was looking for me, if Charlotte had reported me missing, if the world outside these walls even remembered I existed. On the third morning, the door opened, and I braced myself for another interrogation, but the man who entered was not Alexander. He was younger, softer around the edges, with the same dark hair and sharp cheekbones, but none of the predatory menace that defined his brother. He carried a tray laden with food, real food, not the scraps I had been choking down. And he set it on the table by the window with an apologetic smile that seemed entirely out of place in this house of shadows. I am Thomas. He pulled a chair over and sat without waiting for invitation, his posture relaxed in a way that felt deliberately non-threatening. I wanted to apologize for my brother. He is not always like this. I almost laughed at the absurdity of the understatement, but something in his earnest expression stopped me. Like what exactly? I heard the edge in my own voice, the exhaustion and fear sharpening every word, like a man who kidnaps pregnant women and holds them prisoner because of a piece of jewelry. Thomas winced, and I saw genuine discomfort flicker across his features. He has his reasons, even if his methods are inexcusable. 2 years ago, the woman he loved was killed. A car bomb meant for him. She was wearing a necklace identical to yours when she died, and he buried it with her because he could not bear to look at it anymore. The words hit me like a physical blow, and I sank onto the edge of the bed, my hand finding my belly in the protective gesture that had become instinct. He told me her name was Isabella. I watched Thomas nod, and I saw the grief that lived in him, too muted but present, like an old wound that never quite healed. She was everything to him. Light in a world that had taught him darkness was the only currency that mattered. When she died, something in Alexander died with her, and what rose from the ashes was colder, harder, more ruthless than anything he had been before. He runs the syndicate now with an iron fist, and no one dares cross him. But I remember the man he was before, and sometimes late at night I catch glimpses of that man still buried beneath all that ice. I thought about what Thomas was telling me about the monster who had dragged me into this nightmare, and I felt something shift in my perception. Not forgiveness, not yet, but understanding perhaps of wounds that ran deeper than cruelty. Thomas leaned forward, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. There are things about Isabella's death that never made sense to me, details that did not add up. I have never said this to Alexander because I have no proof, but I think someone close to us betrayed her. Before I could respond, the door swung open, and a man I had not seen before stepped inside. Tall, silver-haired, with eyes like chips of flint, he surveyed me with an expression that made my blood turn to ice. "Frederick Ashworth at your service." His smile did not reach his eyes. "I see our guest is being well entertained." Sleep would not come no matter how I tried to court it, and sometime past midnight I gave up the pretense and slipped from my room into the darkened hallway. The estate was different at night, all shadows and silence, and the distant sound of guards moving through their patrols like ghosts with purpose. I wandered without destination, my bare feet silent on the cold marble floors, and my hand resting on my belly, where the baby had finally settled after hours of restless movement. I found the library by accident, drawn by the faint glow of firelight spilling through a half-open door, and I pushed it wider before I could think better of the impulse. He sat in a leather chair before the dying flames, a glass of amber liquid in his hand, and his eyes fixed on the portrait above the mantel. I knew her face now from the photographs Thomas had shown me, and from the way Alexander spoke her name like a prayer he no longer believed in. Isabella Montague, rendered in oil and canvas, her dark hair cascading over bare shoulders, and that necklace the twin of the one that hung against my own skin, catching the painted light like drops of frozen blood. He did not turn when I entered, but I saw his shoulders tense, saw the way his fingers tightened around the glass. "You should be sleeping." His voice was rough with whiskey, and something deeper, something that sounded like exhaustion worn down to the bone. "So should you." I moved closer despite every instinct screaming at me to retreat, and I settled into the chair across from his, because I was tired of being afraid, and tired of being alone, and tired of pretending that the man before me was only a monster. He looked at me, then really looked, and in the firelight, his eyes were not ice at all, but something molten, something that burned. "She used to sit exactly where you are sitting." The words came slowly, like he was pulling them from somewhere deep and painful. "She would read while I worked, and sometimes she would look up and smile and the whole world would stop." I did not know what to say, so I said nothing, and the silence stretched between us filled with the crackle of flames and the weight of grief too heavy for words. My mother used to hum while she sewed. I heard my own voice soft and strange in the darkness. Old songs from somewhere she would never name, and when I was small, I thought she was the most beautiful woman in the world, and when she died, I thought I would never stop feeling empty. His eyes met mine, and something passed between us. Recognition, perhaps, of wounds that mirrored each other, of loneliness that ran deeper than circumstance. She was the only light I had. His voice cracked on the confession, and I watched this powerful, dangerous man fracture before me. When she died, I buried that light with her, and I have been living in darkness ever since. I reached across the space between us and my fingers brushed his knuckles where they gripped the glass. Maybe the darkness does not have to last forever. He turned his hand beneath mine, and for one breathless moment we were just two broken people holding on to each other in the night. The morning after our moment in the library, Alexander summoned me to his study, and the softness I had glimpsed the night before had retreated behind walls of ice and purpose. He stood behind his desk, surrounded by papers and photographs, and men I did not recognize, and when his eyes met mine, I saw something new burning beneath the cold. "We found something." His voice was clipped efficient, the voice of a man who had built an empire on control and decisiveness. "Your mother, Maria Fairfax, was not who she claimed to be." I felt the floor tilt beneath my feet, and my hand found the back of a chair to steady myself as one of his investigators stepped forward with a file thick enough to contain a lifetime of secrets. Her real name was Maria Montague. She had a sister named Catherine who married into one of the oldest families in the city, the Montagues. The name meant nothing to me, but I watched Alexander's face and saw recognition, saw the pieces of a puzzle clicking into place behind his eyes. Isabella's family. The words came out strangled, and I struggled to understand what he was telling me. What connection could possibly exist between my seamstress mother and the woman whose portrait hung above his fireplace? The necklace you wear is a Montague heirloom. His voice had dropped to something dangerous and quiet. It has been in their family for 6 generations passed from mother to daughter, and there was only ever one. I touched the rubies at my throat, feeling their familiar weight, and wondering how something so beautiful could carry so much darkness. But Isabella was wearing it when she died. I said the words slowly, trying to make sense of the impossible. You buried it with her. I watched Alexander's hands curl into fists on the surface of his desk, watched the tendons strain against his skin as he fought for control. That is exactly the problem. If your necklace is real and everything we have found suggests it is, then the one in Isabella's coffin must be a fake. Someone switched them. Someone with access to her body before the burial. The implications crashed over me like a wave, and I saw the same terrible understanding dawn in Thomas's eyes, where he stood in the corner silent and watchful. Who would do that? My voice was barely a whisper, and why? Alexander's answer was a single word that fell like a stone into still water. Exhumation. He was going to dig up his dead fiancée to prove a theory that someone close to him had betrayed everything he held sacred. I should have been horrified, and part of me was, but beneath the horror I felt something else. The first stirring of a truth that had been buried as deep as Isabella herself. In the hallway outside, Frederick Ashworth passed by the open door, and for just a moment our eyes met, and I saw something flicker in those flint-gray depths. Something that looked like calculation. Something that looked like fear. He smiled at me, and the cold that ran down my spine had nothing to do with the temperature. I was getting closer to something he wanted to stay hidden, and in his smile I read the promise that he would do whatever it took to stop me. The days blurred together in a strange rhythm of waiting and watching, and something else I did not want to name. Alexander appeared at my door each morning with some excuse or another. A book he thought I might enjoy. Questions about whether the doctor he had sent was adequate. Concerns about whether I was eating enough for the baby. I told myself his attention was purely practical, that I remained valuable only as long as I held answers he needed, but I could not ignore the way his gaze lingered when he thought I was not looking. The ice in his eyes had begun to thaw around the edges, revealing depths I had not expected to find in a man who commanded an empire built on violence and fear. On the 4th day, he brought me to the garden, and we walked together through roses that bloomed red as the rubies at my throat, and he asked me about the baby. What I hoped for, what I feared. I told him I feared being alone, and his hand brushed mine so briefly I might have imagined it except for the electricity that raced up my arm and settled somewhere behind my ribs. That night, I lay awake replaying that touch and hating myself for wanting more of it. He was dangerous. He was holding me captive. He was mourning another woman. And yet, when he appeared in my doorway the next morning and the light caught the sharp planes of his face, I felt my breath catch in my throat. He noticed. I saw his eyes darken, saw his jaw tighten with something that looked like restraint. We need to talk about what happens next. His voice was rough, and I wondered if he had slept as poorly as I had. He stepped into the room and suddenly the space felt too small and too warm, and I was acutely aware of every inch of distance between us. The exhumation is scheduled for tomorrow. Whatever we find will change everything. I should have been thinking about coffins and conspiracies and the danger that lurked in the shadows of his empire, but all I could focus on was the way he was looking at me, like I was something precious and terrifying all at once. I made a joke, then something foolish, about whether his gardener would be offended that I had been stealing roses from the garden, and for one crystalline moment his face transformed. He laughed. The sound was rusty with disuse, and it cracked something open inside my chest. I felt tears prick my eyes, and I did not know if they were for him, or for myself, or for the impossible situation we had found ourselves tangled in. He crossed to me then, and his hand rose to cup my cheek, and I should have pulled away, should have remembered all the reasons this was madness. But instead, I leaned into his palm and let myself feel safe, for the first time in months. I cannot be what he was for you. The words escaped before I could stop them. I am not Isabella. His thumb traced my cheekbone, and his eyes held mine with an intensity that stole my breath. No, you are not. And that is exactly why I cannot stop thinking about you. The morning of the exhumation, I woke to an empty house and a note on my bedside table written in Alexander's sharp, slanting hand. Stay inside. I will return before nightfall. I pressed my fingers to the paper where his pen had touched and wondered when I had started measuring my days by his presence and his absence. The hours crawled past, and I found myself pacing the length of my gilded cage, unable to eat, unable to read, unable to do anything but imagine what was happening in that cemetery where Isabella Montague had been laid to rest 2 years ago. I touched my necklace constantly, feeling the weight of rubies that suddenly seemed heavier than they had before, and I thought about the woman who had worn its twin to her grave and the man who had placed it there with his own shaking hands. When the door finally opened and Alexander walked through, I knew before he spoke a single word that everything had changed. His face was ashen, and his eyes held a wildness I had never seen before, and behind him, Thomas wore an expression of barely contained shock. It was fake. Alexander's voice cracked on the word, and I watched something shatter inside him. The necklace I buried with her was a replica. Someone switched them before the funeral. I crossed to him without thinking, and my hand found his arm, and I felt the tremor running through his body like an earthquake threatening to bring down everything he had built. He looked at me then, and in his eyes I saw grief transforming into something darker and more dangerous. Who had access to her body? The question was directed at Thomas, but his gaze never left mine, as though I had become an anchor in a storm that threatened to sweep him away. Thomas listed names in a hollow voice. The funeral director, the family members who said goodbye, Frederick, who had insisted on a private moment to pay his respects. At Frederick's name, something flickered across Alexander's face, and I felt the air in the room change. I remembered the way Frederick had looked at me in the hallway, that cold, calculating smile that had sent ice down my spine, and suddenly the pieces began arranging themselves into a picture I did not want to see. Your necklace is real. Alexander's hand came up to touch the rubies at my throat, and his fingers were gentle despite the rage I could feel coiling inside him. Someone gave your mother the original and put a fake in Isabella's coffin. Someone who had access and opportunity and reason to want that necklace to disappear. But why? My voice sounded strange to my own ears. What would anyone gain from switching a piece of jewelry on a dead woman? Alexander's jaw tightened, and when he spoke, his voice was ice and fire and the promise of violence. That is exactly what I intend to find out. And when I do, there will be nowhere on this earth they can hide from me. I believed him, and for the first time since this nightmare began, that belief felt less like fear and more like faith. The gunfire woke me from a dream of Alexander's hands on my face, and for one disorienting moment, I thought the sound was part of the nightmare, until the second burst shattered the window at the far end of the hallway, and I understood that the nightmare had followed me into waking. I rolled from the bed and pressed myself against the floor, my heart hammering so hard I could feel the baby kick in response to my terror, and I crawled toward the corner of the room where the heavy wardrobe might offer some protection. The estate that had felt like a fortress now felt like a trap, and I could hear shouting and more gunfire and the sound of bodies hitting the floor. And I did not know if those bodies belonged to Alexander's men or to whoever had come for us in the dark. I thought of Frederick and that cold, calculating smile, and I knew with a certainty that settled like ice in my veins that this was his doing, that he had decided I was too dangerous to leave alive. The door to my room shuddered under impact, and I bit back a scream and looked frantically for anything I could use as a weapon, but there was nothing, and I was pregnant and alone, and the people outside that door wanted me dead. Then I heard his voice cutting through the chaos like a blade, and something in my chest released, because Alexander was coming, and somehow I knew that he would tear through anything and anyone to reach me. The door burst open, and two men rushed in, but they never made it more than 3 steps, because Alexander was behind them, and the sound of his gun was the most beautiful and terrible thing I had ever heard. They fell, and he stepped over their bodies without a glance, and then his arms were around me, and I was pressed against his chest, and I could feel his heart racing as fast as mine. "You are safe." His voice was ragged, and his hands moved over me, checking for injuries, and when they settled on my belly, I felt tears streaming down my face. "The baby. I am fine. We are fine." He pulled back just enough to look at my face, and in the dim light I could see blood splattered across his shirt, and his eyes were wild with something that looked like fear and rage and relief all tangled together. I should have been horrified by the violence, by the bodies cooling on the floor, by the smell of gunpowder that hung in the air. But all I felt was gratitude so overwhelming it stole my breath. Someone betrayed us. His voice hardened, and I watched him transform from the man who had held me so gently back into the Mafia boss who commanded an empire built on blood. They knew exactly when to strike, and exactly where you would be. I thought of all the people who moved through this estate, the guards, the servants, the men who answered to Alexander, and I wondered which one of them had sold us out, and whether they had any idea what Alexander would do when he found them. The attack had failed, but the war was just beginning, and somewhere in the shadows, Frederick Ashworth was already planning his next move. The safe house was a cabin in the woods 2 hours from the city, and Alexander drove us there himself through the pre-dawn darkness, while I sat in the passenger seat with my hands clasped over my belly and tried to stop shaking. Thomas had stayed behind to manage the aftermath and hunt for the traitor, and I could still hear Alexander's voice when he told his brother to trust no one, and I wondered what it did to a man to suspect everyone he had ever relied upon. The cabin was small compared to the estate, but it felt more real somehow with its worn wooden floors and the fireplace that crackled with warmth when Alexander lit it, and the windows that looked out onto nothing but trees and sky. He showed me to a bedroom with a quilt on the bed that smelled like cedar, and I noticed there was only one other room, and I did not ask where he would sleep, because I already knew the answer was nowhere, because he would spend the night watching for enemies that might follow us into this temporary sanctuary. My hand had been cut on broken glass during the chaos of the attack, and I had not even noticed until Alexander took my wrist in the dim light of the kitchen and examined the wound with a gentleness that made my breath catch. "This needs cleaning." His voice was rough, and I watched him gather supplies, and I sat at the small wooden table while he knelt before me and dabbed antiseptic on the cut with hands that had killed men just hours ago. The sting was nothing compared to the awareness that flooded through me when his fingers brushed against my palm. And when he looked up, our faces were inches apart, and I could see the exhaustion in his eyes and the fear he was trying so hard to hide. "Why did you come for me?" The question escaped before I could stop it, and I watched something flicker across his face, something raw and unguarded. "You could have sent your men. You could have stayed safe." He was quiet for a long moment, and his thumb traced an absent pattern on my wrist, and when he spoke his voice was barely a whisper. "I do not know." But that was a lie, and we both knew it, and the truth hung in the air between us, heavy and terrifying and inevitable. That night, I lay in the darkness listening to the wind in the trees. And I heard him outside my door, and I knew he was standing guard because he could not trust anyone else with my safety, and something cracked open in my chest at the thought of this dangerous man, keeping watch through the long hours while I slept. I rose from the bed and opened the door and found him there just as I knew I would, and we looked at each other in the moonlight that filtered through the windows, and neither of us spoke because there were no words for what was happening between us. I reached out and took his hand and felt him tense and then relax, and I led him inside, not for anything more than this, just to sit together in the dark and let the silence hold us. And when his arm came around my shoulders, I leaned into his warmth and felt for the first time in years that I was exactly where I was supposed to be. The call came on the second morning at the safe house, and I watched Alexander's face transform as he listened, and I knew before he spoke a word that something fundamental had shifted. He ended the call and stood motionless for a long moment, staring at nothing. And when he finally looked at me, his eyes held a rage so cold and absolute that I felt my blood turn to ice. The jeweler talked. His voice was flat and controlled, but I could hear the violence coiled beneath every syllable. The fake necklace, the one buried with Isabella, was commissioned 2 years ago by someone I trusted with my life, with her life, with everything. He did not say the name, but I already knew, and I watched him piece together the truth that would shatter every foundation he had built his empire upon. Frederick Ashworth ordered the replica 3 days before the bombing, and he paid in cash, and he told the jeweler it was a surprise gift for a woman he loved. Alexander's hands clenched at his sides, and I could see the tendons standing out beneath his skin, and I understood in that moment that Frederick had not just betrayed his boss, but had murdered the woman Alexander loved and let him spend 2 years drowning in guilt for a death that was never his fault. He loved her. The words came out like broken glass, and Alexander turned away from me, and his shoulders shook with something that might have been grief or rage, or both tangled together beyond separation. Frederick was in love with Isabella, and she rejected him and I never knew, and he stood beside me at her funeral and watched me blame myself, and he put his hand on my shoulder and told me we would find the people responsible. I rose from my chair and crossed the room to stand behind him, and I did not know what to say, because there were no words for this kind of betrayal, but I placed my hand on his back and felt the tension vibrating through his body like a wire pulled too tight. She never told me. His voice cracked and I heard 2 years of anguish in that small fracture. She never said Frederick had approached her, and I wonder now if she was protecting me or protecting him, and it does not matter because he killed her for refusing. Him, and he let me wage war against innocent men while he smiled and planned and waited. I thought of Frederick's cold, calculating eyes and the way he had watched me at the estate, and I realized that the attack had never been about rival families at all, but about silencing the one person whose existence threatened to expose his carefully constructed lies. Alexander turned and looked at me, and his face was carved from stone, but his eyes burned with a fury that promised death slow and certain and absolute. He took everything from me. His hand reached up and touched my face with a gentleness that stood in stark contrast to the murder in his gaze. And then he tried to take you. I will find him, Eleanor, and when I do, there will be no mercy and no forgiveness, and no quick death. I believed him completely, and I was not afraid. The next revelation came 3 days later, and it rewrote everything I thought I knew about my own history. Alexander had been on the phone for hours with his investigators, and I had learned to read the tension in his shoulders and the clench of his jaw, and when he finally ended the call and turned to face me, I saw something in his eyes that made my heart stutter. "Sit down, Eleanor." His voice was gentle in a way that frightened me more than his anger ever had, and I lowered myself onto the worn sofa and watched him pace the length of the small cabin like a caged predator working up to something terrible. "Your mother was not who you thought she was." The words landed like stones in still water, and I felt the ripples spreading outward through everything I had believed about my life. Her name was not Maria Fairfax, and she was not a simple seamstress who came from nowhere. She was Maria Montague, and she was Isabella's aunt, and she fled her family 30 years ago after a scandal that got her disowned and erased from the official records. I opened my mouth to protest, but no sound came out because I was thinking of my mother's silences and her secrets, and the way she would sometimes look at the necklace with tears in her eyes and refuse to explain why. She took the necklace when she left because it was her birthright, and because it was the only thing of value she could carry, and she spent the rest of her life hiding from the family she had betrayed. Alexander knelt before me and took my hands, and his grip was warm and steady, and I clung to it like an anchor in a storm. You are Isabella's cousin Eleanor, and you carry Montague blood, and that means you have legitimate claim to assets and properties that Frederick has been quietly siphoning for years. I understood then why Frederick had tried so hard to eliminate me, and why the attack on the estate had been so desperate and so poorly planned, because I was not just a witness to his crimes, but living proof that the Montague line continued, and that everything he had stolen could be reclaimed. My whole life has been a lie. I heard my voice break, and I hated the weakness in it, but Alexander did not seem to notice or did not seem to care, because he pulled me against his chest and held me while the truth settled into my bones. Your mother loved you enough to give up everything she knew to keep you safe, and that is not a lie. That is the only truth that matters. But I could not stop thinking about the questions I had never asked, and the answers my mother had taken to her grave, and the strange, sad smile she wore whenever I asked about my father or my grandparents, or why we never had family to visit during holidays. I thought of Isabella, the cousin I never knew, and how we might have grown up together in another life, and how Frederick had stolen that possibility along with so many others. He knew. The realization hit me like ice water, and I pulled back to look at Alexander. Frederick knew who my mother was, and he knew if I ever surfaced, I could expose everything, and he has been waiting for this moment since before Isabella died. Alexander nodded, and his eyes were hard as flint. You were always a loose end, Eleanor, and now you are a target, and that is why I am not going to let him get anywhere near you. The weight of everything crashed over me like a wave I could not outrun, and I felt my knees buckle and my breath come in ragged gasps. And before I could fall, Alexander was there catching me, pulling me against his chest, and holding me while the sobs tore through my body with a violence that frightened me. I cried for my mother and the secret she carried to her grave, and I cried for the cousin I never knew, and the life that had been stolen from both of us. And I cried for myself because I did not know who I was anymore, and the ground beneath my feet had turned to sand. Alexander said nothing, and that was exactly what I needed, because words would have felt like intrusion, and instead, he simply held me and let me fall apart in his arms, and his heartbeat was steady against my cheek, like a drum calling me back from the edge of hysteria. When the storm finally passed, I found myself exhausted and empty and strangely calm, sitting on the floor of the cabin with my back against the sofa and Alexander beside me, close enough that our shoulders touched. I do not know how long we sat there in silence, but when I finally spoke, my voice was raw and cracked like old leather. Everything I believed about myself was a lie. He turned his head to look at me, and his eyes held something I had never seen there before, something soft and vulnerable, and entirely unguarded. Not everything, Eleanor, and not a lie, just a story your mother told to keep you safe. And there is a difference even if it does not feel like one right now. I looked at him, then really looked at the sharp angles of his face, and the darkness that lived behind his eyes, and the careful way he held himself, as if he was afraid of breaking something precious. You have been carrying your own lies for 2 years, and how do you survive it? How do you keep breathing when the person you trusted most turns out to be the monster in the story? His jaw tightened, and I watched him struggle with the answer, and when it came, his voice was barely a whisper. I did not survive it, Eleanor. I just kept moving, and I told myself that forward was the only direction that mattered, and I buried everything else so deep I thought it could never touch me again. But you were wrong. I said it gently without accusation, and he nodded slowly, and his hand found mine on the floor between us, and his fingers laced through mine as if we had done this 1,000 times before. I was wrong, and then you walked into that restaurant wearing a dead woman's necklace, and everything I buried came crawling back, and I should have hated you for it, but instead you made me feel alive for the first time in 2 years, and I do not know what to do with that. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat, and I knew I should pull away, should protect myself, should remember that this man had kidnapped me and threatened me and dragged me into a world of violence and death. But I also remembered the way he fought through gunfire to reach me, and the way he stood guard outside my door, and the way he looked at me like I was something worth protecting, and I was so tired of being afraid of wanting things. I am terrified of trusting you. The words came out before I could stop them, honest and raw and trembling. And I am terrified of not trusting you because you are the first person who has made me feel safe since my mother died, and I do not know what that means. He lifted his free hand and cupped my face, and his touch was gentle as if I was made of glass, and his eyes searched mine for permission. It means we are both broken, and maybe that is exactly why this works. He kissed me then, and I kissed him back, and it was desperate, and healing, and complicated all at once, tasting of tears and hope, and the terrifying possibility of something real. When we finally pulled apart, he pressed his forehead against mine and made me a promise. I will protect you and the baby with everything I have and everything I am, and nothing in this world will touch you while I am breathing. I believed him completely. Frederick Ashworth had spent 2 years building his empire within an empire, and he was not about to let one pregnant woman and a dead girl's necklace bring it all crashing down around him. He paced the floor of his private office and reviewed every mistake, every overlooked detail, every moment where he should have been more careful. And the list grew longer with each passing hour, until he wanted to put his fist through the wall. The bribed associate had cost him $5,000, but the information was worth every cent, because now he knew exactly where Alexander had hidden his precious little house guest, and he knew that Alexander and Thomas were meeting at the docks to plan his downfall, and he knew that Eleanor would be alone with only 2 guards, neither of whom had ever faced real combat. The drive to the safe house took 40 minutes through winding, back roads, and Frederick used every second to rehearse what he would say, and what he would do, and how he would finally end this nightmare that had started the day Isabella Montague looked at him with pity instead of love. He had worshipped her, and she had chosen Alexander, and when Frederick finally worked up the courage to confess his feelings, she had laughed and called him sweet, and told him she was sure he would find someone someday, and the memory still burned like acid in his chest. The cabin appeared through the trees, small and unremarkable, and nothing like the fortress that should have protected the woman who threatened everything he had built. The guards were easy enough to dispatch quietly, efficiently. The skills he had learned in Alexander's service turned against his own people, and Frederick felt nothing as their bodies hit the ground, because they were just obstacles between him and survival. The door was not even locked, and he pushed it open to find Eleanor standing in the kitchen with a glass of water frozen like a deer in headlights, and so pathetically pregnant that for a moment he almost felt sorry for what he was about to do. "You must be Frederick." Her voice was steadier than he expected, and he watched her eyes dart toward the exits, calculating her options and finding none. "I wondered when you would come for me yourself instead of sending hired thugs to do your dirty work." He laughed because she had spirit, and that was something Isabella never had, despite all her other qualities, and he raised his gun and pointed it at her chest and watched the color drain from her face as reality finally sank in. "You look like her, you know, and I did not see it at first. But now that I know who you really are, I can see the Montague cheekbones and the stubborn set of your jaw, and it makes me sick, because I thought I had erased that bloodline forever." Eleanor backed slowly toward the counter, and her hand pressed against her belly in that protective gesture he had seen so many times, and he wondered if the baby would have looked like Isabella if it had been allowed to grow up. "She was never going to love you." Eleanor's words hit like bullets, and Frederick's hand tightened on the gun. "You killed her, because you could not stand being rejected, and now you are going to kill me for the same reason. And what does that make you, Frederick? What kind of man murders women because they will not worship him? He needed her to stop talking, and he needed to pull the trigger, and he needed to disappear before Alexander returned. But instead, he found himself explaining everything, because someone should know the truth before she died. The sound of tires on gravel cut through Frederick's monologue, and I saw something shift in his eyes, something that looked like the first crack in a dam that had been holding back an ocean of panic and desperation. He grabbed my arm and yanked me in front of him, using my body as a shield, and the barrel of the gun pressed cold and hard against my temple, and I forced myself to breathe, to think, to survive, because my baby needed me to survive. The front door crashed open, and Alexander stood there with Thomas flanking from the side entrance, and for one suspended moment nobody moved, and the air itself seemed to thicken with violence waiting to be unleashed. Alexander's face was carved from stone, but his eyes burned with a fury so absolute, so controlled, that it terrified me more than Frederick's unhinged desperation ever could, and I understood in that moment that I was looking at the man who had built an empire on blood and bone and merciless calculation. "Let her go, Frederick, and we can discuss terms." Alexander's voice was calm, almost conversational, but I could hear the razor edge beneath it, the promise of pain that made Frederick's hand tremble against my arm. "There are no terms anymore, and you know that, and I know that, so let us stop pretending this ends any way, except with one of us dead." Frederick laughed, and it was an ugly, broken sound, and his grip on me tightened until I could feel bruises forming. "I want safe passage out of the country, and I want 10 million in an offshore account, and I want your word that nobody follows me. And in exchange, I will let your pregnant little plaything live long enough to give birth." Thomas shifted slightly to the left, drawing Frederick's attention for just a fraction of a second, and I knew this was my only chance because Alexander's eyes met mine, and I saw the question there, and I answered with the smallest nod imperceptible to anyone who was not looking for it. My fingers closed around the heavy marble bookend on the counter behind me, and I waited, and I prayed, and I watched Frederick's trigger finger twitch as Thomas moved again. "Now." The word was not spoken aloud, but I heard it anyway in the language that Alexander and I had somehow learned to speak. In the weeks of forced proximity and stolen moments, and I swung the bookend with every ounce of strength I possessed, connecting with Frederick's forearm just as the gun discharged. The bullet shattered a window somewhere to my left, and then I was falling, and Alexander was moving faster than I thought possible, crossing the distance between us in the time it took me to hit the floor. The sounds that followed were brutal and wet, and I curled into myself, protecting my belly and squeezing my eyes shut, because some things should not be witnessed, even when they are necessary. When silence finally fell, I felt hands on my face, gentle, despite the blood that covered them, and I opened my eyes to find Alexander kneeling beside me, searching my body for wounds and asking if I was hurt, and the concern in his voice cracked something open inside me. I did not look at what remained of Frederick Ashworth, but I knew from Alexander's grim satisfaction that justice had finally been served. The hours after Frederick's death blurred together like watercolors bleeding into each other, and I found myself sitting in a pristine bathroom at the estate while a doctor Thomas had summoned checked my vitals and assured me that the baby was fine, that stress had not triggered early labor, that I was physically unharmed despite everything. Physically unharmed felt like a cruel joke when I could still hear the sounds of Alexander's fists connecting with flesh, when I could still smell the copper tang of blood when I closed my eyes and saw Frederick's face twisted with madness and obsession. The syndicate moved with terrifying efficiency to clean up the aftermath, and within 24 hours it was as if Frederick Ashworth had never existed at all, except for the whispers that spread through Alexander's organization about betrayal and justice, and the boss's pregnant woman who had fought back when cornered. I learned that the full truth had been revealed to Alexander's inner circle, that Frederick had murdered Isabella out of jealous obsession, that he had framed rival families, that he had nearly destroyed everything the Sinclairs had built on a foundation of wounded pride and unrequited love. Thomas came to see me on the second day and told me that Alexander had not slept, since the safe house that he was handling business, putting out fires, ensuring stability, but that he kept asking about me, kept wanting to know if I was eating, if I was resting, if I needed anything at all. On the third day, Alexander finally appeared in my doorway, looking more exhausted than I had ever seen him, with shadows under his eyes, and tension carved into every line of his body, and he stood there for a long moment before he spoke. "I have made arrangements for you to leave," and the words hit me like a physical blow, even though I had been expecting them, even though they made perfect sense. "There is a house in Vermont, under a name that cannot be traced back to me or the syndicate, and you would have enough money to never work again, and the baby would be safe, and you could have the normal life you deserve, far away from everything I represent." He delivered this speech like a man offering his own execution, like every word cost him something precious. And I realized that he was trying to give me a choice that he had never given me before. A real choice made without coercion, or captivity, or fear. I could leave, and he would let me. And he would probably spend the rest of his life wondering what might have been. But he would let me go. Because somewhere in the weeks of forced proximity, and shared danger, and stolen kisses, he had learned to put my needs above his own. "What do you want, Alexander?" And my voice came out steadier than I expected, and I watched his composure crack just slightly around the edges. "I want you to stay, but I have no right to ask that of you after everything I have put you through, after the danger and the violence, and the world I would be asking you to accept." I thought about the waitress I had been just weeks ago, struggling to pay rent, terrified of single motherhood, wearing my mother's necklace, without knowing it would change everything. And that woman felt like a stranger now, like a character from a story I had read long ago. "I need time to think," and he nodded once, accepting my answer without argument, and something in his eyes told me he would wait as long as it took. The weeks that followed Frederick's death moved slowly, like honey dripping from a spoon, and I found myself settling into a rhythm I had never expected to find at the Sinclair estate, waking each morning in the lavish guest room that no longer felt like a cage, walking the grounds that no longer felt like a prison, eating meals at the long dining table where Alexander now sat across from me, instead of at the distant head. I had made my choice, and it surprised me how little I regretted it, how the normal life I had once craved now seemed like a faded photograph of someone else's dreams. Alexander introduced me to his world properly, this time not as a captive or a curiosity, but as someone who belonged at his side, and I attended meetings where men who had once looked at me with suspicion now nodded with something approaching respect. I set boundaries, and he honored them without question, giving me space when I needed it, never pushing for more than I was ready to give, and in return, I offered him pieces of myself that I had kept locked away for years. My pregnancy progressed and my belly grew round and heavy, and Alexander's fascination with the changes in my body would have been amusing if it were not so touching, the way he placed his hand against my skin to feel the baby kick, the way he read books about childbirth and infant care when he thought I was not watching. One evening, he asked me about the baby's father, and I told him the truth, that it had been a moment of loneliness and too much wine, and a man whose name I barely remembered, who had disappeared before I even knew I was pregnant. He listened without judgment, and then he asked if I would want him involved in the child's life, and the vulnerability in his voice nearly broke me, because here was the most dangerous man I had ever known, terrified of rejection, terrified that he might not be worthy of loving a child who was not even his by blood. "Yes," I said, and I watched something unfurl in his chest, something that looked like hope, taking root in scorched earth. Later that night, I found him in his study, standing beneath Isabella's portrait, and I almost retreated to give him privacy, but he heard me and turned and held out his hand. "I have been holding on to her ghost for 2 years," he said, and his voice was rough with emotion, and I thought that keeping her memory alive was the same as keeping her alive, but it is not, and she is gone, and you are here, and I think she would want me to choose the living over the dead. He reached up and took the portrait down from the wall, handling it with reverence and care. And I helped him wrap it in cloth, and we carried it together to the attic where it would rest with other memories too precious to discard but too painful to display. When we returned to the study, the wall was empty, and the room felt different, lighter somehow, and Alexander pulled me close and pressed his forehead against mine. I am choosing you, Eleanor, and I am choosing whatever future we can build together, and I need you to know that this is not settling or second best, but something entirely new. I kissed him then, and tasted salt, and knew that we were both finally ready to stop looking backward. The pain started at 3 in the morning, a tightening wave that pulled me from sleep and left me gasping in the darkness of the bedroom I now shared with Alexander. And for a moment, I thought it was a dream, another nightmare about Frederick, about gunfire, about blood. But then the second wave came, and I knew this was real. This was happening. This was my daughter announcing her arrival into a world that had changed so completely since that blind date at an upscale restaurant where a dangerous man had seen my mother's necklace and refused to let me leave. Alexander woke the instant I gripped his arm, and the transformation that came over him would have been comical if I were not currently trying to breathe through a contraction. Because here was the man who had killed without hesitation, who commanded an empire of shadows, who had faced down betrayal and violence and grief, and he looked absolutely terrified at the prospect of childbirth. He called for Thomas and the doctor and the car, and he helped me dress in gentle, fumbling movements that betrayed his shaking hands, and I found myself reassuring him that this was natural, that women had been doing this for millennia, that I was strong enough to handle it even as another wave crested, and I had to stop talking to simply survive the sensation. The hospital was private and discreet, and the staff asked no questions when Alexander Sinclair arrived with his pregnant partner and an entourage of armed men who took up positions in the hallway as if rival assassins might choose this moment to strike. The hours blurred together in a haze of pain and pressure, and Alexander never left my side, not once holding my hand even when I squeezed hard enough to leave bruises, murmuring words of encouragement that sounded foreign coming from a man who usually spoke in commands and threats. When the doctor told me to push, I thought of my mother, who had done this alone 28 years ago, who had carried the secret of her Montague heritage to her grave, who had given me a necklace that would lead me to love in the most impossible way, and I pushed with everything I had, honoring her memory and claiming my future in the same desperate effort. The cry that filled the room was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard, a tiny, fierce announcement of life, and Alexander made a noise beside me, something between a laugh and a sob as the doctor placed our daughter on my chest, and I looked down at her perfect, wrinkled face and knew that every terrifying moment had led to this. We named her Maria Isabella for the mothers we had lost, and the love that had brought us through darkness, and Alexander held her with such reverent care that I fell in love with him all over again, watching this dangerous man become soft and awed in the presence of new life. Later, when the chaos settled, and it was just the three of us in the quiet hospital room, Alexander lifted the Montague necklace from the table where I had placed it during delivery and clasped it around my neck, and the rubies caught the light like drops of blood transformed into something precious. "You are my family now," he said, and his voice held none of its usual command, only raw, unguarded truth, and I pulled him down to kiss him softly while our daughter slept between us. Outside, Thomas stood guard, and the Sinclair empire continued its complicated existence, but inside this room there was only peace, only the beginning of something I had never dared to hope for, and I knew that whatever dangers tomorrow might bring, we would face them together.